Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or whatever makes you happy. Welcome to another rousing episode of CRM Convos. This is number 175 in our series. So if you want to get caught up, it's going to take you a while. Today, we plan to have a discussion about the substance underneath the hype about generative AI rather, and we've got two very sharp minds here to help us with that. We've got Jon Reed, co-founder of Diginomica, and we've got Dr. Michael Wu, who is currently the chief AI strategist for Pros and has been doing artificial intelligence work for a very long time. Gentlemen, welcome.
Welcome.
A pleasure to be here.
All right. So now that I've given the basic introduction, I should probably give you a chance to fill in the blanks and introduce yourselves the rest of the way, just so that the audience has some idea of what we're getting into.
What are we getting into? This should be good.
In trouble.
A great big spaghetti mess, we hope.
Cool. Well, I think I found myself onto this show because I picked fights with Michael in chats and previous shows. But look, to be fair, a lot of the issues that I have with AI have nothing to do with Michael. I've enjoyed pretty much everything. Every single thing that Michael's had to say about AI, basically, have agreed with in the past, at least fundamentally. I mean, obviously, there's important room for disagreements in such an area. But in general, just real quick, I think it was about 9 months ago, Thomas, you had me on a debate. It was a Web 3.0 metaverse debate, and I was really interested in winning that debate because I felt that the concepts underneath that were fraudulent, and I felt I won that debate. And I think time has kind of shown why, right? And I'm not looking to win a debate here today. I mean, the impact of AI on our culture, society, technology, and business is obviously profound and long-lasting. And so my agenda here today is really to open up that conversation even further so that we can get a better understanding. And so that's really why I'm here.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think the topic around AI, especially generative AI, is so new and there's so much unknown about it. In fact, I could tell you, 20 things that even the research community cannot explain to me and cannot understand why, don't offer any insights into why they behave the way they do. And it's a bit kind of, like scary to some extent. And I think, therefore, I think it's a very good to have these type of healthy discussion and maybe even a healthy tension, right? To make sure that these, I would say, worries are addressed and, by either researchers or some who are doing the research on this or development on this, make sure that they make these AI better and can help us in the long run. So
I would like to say one thing for the host, just as you're teeing up topics for today. A couple things that are really important to me, obviously we can look at this in the context well beyond the enterprise. I spent a lot of time looking at the impact of AI on creativity for some very personal reasons. I spent a lot of time on AI and disinformation and democracy for some very self-interested reasons at all, because I care about the future of democracy. But I also spent a lot of time in the enterprise because obviously that's what Diginomica does. There's a few things just as teasers that I'm prepared to talk about today. One is solvable and not solvable generative AI problems. I think some generative AI problems are more solvable than others. I'd love to hear Michael's take on some of those. I believe this is more of an evolutionary than revolutionary technology when it comes to enterprise hype, and I can explain why. And also, I think this fall was fundamentally a pretty disappointing event season from the vantage point of enterprise AI. There was way more hype and bombast than there was actual substance, but there's some very particular reasons for that, and I understand why that happened. This spring, I think it's going to be very, very important for enterprise generative AI in particular, and also I think what we learn in the next 6 to 12 months about generative AI in the enterprise is going to have pretty important implications for anyone in the field of Gen AI, whether they're enterprise oriented or not, and I'm prepared to get into that. So those are kind of a few of the topics that I'm most interested in covering, and I'll turn it over to the host, and you can decide, where you want to take this discussion.
I love those topics. Why don't we go through all of them? I think I'll leave it to the host to kind of tell us when to switch topic. And I love all of them. I mean,
Hey man, it's a conversation. Let's see where it takes us.
And that is probably more stuff than we have time for.
Yeah,
well, that's why
especially and that we might need to add. Today we will be religiously on time, as both John and Michael need to. Well, they have a hard stop, so it would be unfair to just have them vanish just like that. So, but getting to those.
I'll let you, the host, be the timekeeper, and then to tell us when to move on to the next topic. But I love to hear from you, John. I mean, what are some of the, when you say some of the solvable, unsolvable problem, and I would love to hear, some of the use cases that you like, some of the use cases you like in the enterprise world.
Let's start right there.
Oh, for sure. Okay, cool. Well, and just as a general rule, I think in terms of why the fall season was disappointing, most of that is because we just don't have bona fide customer stories yet, and most of the functionality that's being released is starting to be released now and into December and stuff. So that's one of the reasons why the fall season was kind of full of bombast, because enterprise vendors had to explain to customers that they had a roadmap and a plan around this topic. So I understand why they had to do it, but unfortunately, we weren't able to cover a lot of ground. We did get into some interesting stuff, however, on pricing, as vendors started to talk a little bit about different pricing models, and I think that's a fascinating conversation in and of itself. But so basically, when you look at generative AI in an enterprise context, I think what you find is there are some interesting use cases that might be more out of the box, and then there seems to be a strong desire on customers for co-innovation type projects that have yet been ascertained exactly. I think some of the more exciting use cases have yet to really be fully determined. But when I talk about solvable and non-solvable problems, I think one of my big pitches around this topic is that I think we all need to get more technical than we have in the past, to try to understand what some of the limitations are and what some of the possibilities are. So, for example, like a lot of my colleagues talk a lot about things like bias, ethics, data privacy. Those things are all really important, but it's really important to dig a little deeper into why those issues come up. I mean, so for example, when I think about solvable problems, like some people talk about, for example, data privacy. Oh my God, that's a really huge issue. And it is a huge issue in the consumer space for sure. And the same thing would be true with things like intellectual property, right? That we've already seen a lot of people get into trouble by uploading sensitive material into a chat GPT type of interface, right? But I classify those as solvable problems in an enterprise context. And most of the vendors we heard from this fall had good answers on these topics. Whether you want to talk about, I don't want to name too many vendors, but everyone from Adobe to Oracle, whoever, they all had answers for how they were going to protect customer data privacy. They all had answers for how they were going to protect issues of IP and stuff like that. This is not to say that customers necessarily are going to relax, right? Because there's still pending lawsuits around some of this stuff. But the point is, I think there's some actually, when you look at enterprise LLMs and stuff, those are what I would call more solvable problems. Other examples of problems that I consider potentially more solvable are things like token limits, which affect how much you can feed into these machines, things like model drift. that has been raised as a concern. And the reason I mention these things is a lot of people freak out over these things, whereas I look at them as more solvable problems. But then there's categories of problems that I think are much more difficult to solve. But let me just stop there for a moment.
Yeah, I think those are all valid. They're all. I mean, I think when you said model drift and token limit, these are just engineering problems.
Exactly.
It's just how much kind of working memory do you allocate that window, right? I mean, of course, the more it is, it just it's going to be more expensive, right? So it's a trade-off that engineers have to make, and it's something that I think eventually it translates to cost to the user, right? I mean, so if you're willing to pay for it, then they could keep making it longer context length, and that's fine. And I think in terms of model drift, right? That's something that typically it's no models. In fact, no AI, no machine learning model is kind of fixed and doesn't drift. If it doesn't drift, doesn't adapt, it's not an AI. You might as well have a fixed kind of a program that always does the same thing every time, right? Then you will never drift, right? So a good AI or good machine learning model should drift, and you should drift according to how we react to it and how the environment is using and how the context is. So that's actually a feature. Just like when I say hallucination in generative AI, it's actually a feature. It's not a bug. We try to use it in a fact-based, application. So we've seen it as a bug. But for creative, that's actually a huge feature, right? You want to create things that's never existed before. You want to create text, images or videos or music that were never created before. That's actually a huge feature. But you can actually limit hallucination in your fact-based application through various methods of grounding, right? So,
and I want to get to that because that's on a different, more controversial list. But anyway,
okay.
Thomas, you were going to say something.
Yeah, well, drift I consider drift a feature as well. You want it because, well, you need to adapt to reality or to changing realities.
That's right.
But on the other hand, you don't want to create a monster, or you want to have a monster that self-creates itself, even worse.
Yeah.
What are ways that you see to control this drift? Oh, maybe we are getting comments.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually, so drift is actually a natural consequence of the adaptability of these systems.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
the thing is that, like, we get scared because it adapts and changes itself without us kind of telling it to, right? So that's kind of we fear the loss of control more than we fear this drift, I would say. So I think if you want to make sure that it never drift, like you could kind of always kind of reinitialize it to the kind of actually the same state, right? I mean, scrap all the memory, scrap all the context and everything, start from scratch every time you ask a question, right? Then it's basically, it won't ever kind of change that in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, and Hayam Park actually have a quote from him coming later, but he makes that point around that AI is meant to drift and not be a purely deterministic and factual algorithm. I totally agree with that, and one of the reasons why I highlight the limitations of generative AI at times pretty aggressively is because I find that customers crave a more precise understanding of the pros and cons, and if the vendors aren't going to do it, someone's got to do it, and that someone's got to be people like you and me. And it's actually good that this technology has massive limitations, even though it is incredibly powerful. Both can be true. And the reason it's good is because if it didn't have massive limitations, if these were truly cognitive systems that understood what they were saying and could actually do our jobs for us, then we wouldn't have jobs, and we'd be having this discussion for free with whatever limited savings we had left. So the limitations actually buy us time to solve some of the enormous problems that will come eventually, and exactly when that's going to happen is a little bit of a different story. But so one of the reasons I think it's really important to start categorizing between solvable and less solvable problems is because we make such a fuss over problems that are actually quite solvable, and I don't think that's very helpful. So, for example, another solvable problem was this whole thing around, oh, these are older training sets, blah, blah, blah. Well, a lot of vendors have already moved aggressively to solve that by infusing these data sets with real-time information from vector databases and stuff like that. Another solvable problem, right? But then there's a collection of problems. Now, these are not my most controversial, but these are the ones that I think must be mitigated against and confronted and are never going to totally go away. And I'll be interested in Michael's input on a couple of these. One of them is bias. Bias is never going away from these systems entirely. That would be unrealistic. It's got to be an open conversation, basically, because bias is everything from the data sets that are put into these systems to how these algorithms work to how humans interpret the output of these algorithms and apply them in imperfect human organizations. So bias is a fact. It's just something we have to live with. It existed before these systems. It will exist after these systems. It's a problem. We're always going to have that conversation. So I don't really want to hear people talk about, well, we have these unbiased systems. That just spare me with that bullshit so we can get on with a better conversation about bias. Explainability is a very, very interesting one because I do think we can make progress on explainability, particularly in the context where we're interacting in a bot type manner where information is being delivered to us. In that case, I think a lot of these systems are going to be able to tell us where they pulled certain kinds of information. But these systems do not specialize in explaining how they arrived at certain conclusions. That's not what they do. That's not how they're built. I don't think that's ever going to fundamentally change. I could be wrong. I don't see it changing in the near future. And that has dramatic implications for how we use these systems. So just as an example of that, if you look at the HR space, for example, like job descriptions is one of the so-called low-hanging fruits in this entire field. Because as Hyun Park noted in a blog post, since he was on the show just now, ChatGPT's and other systems like this are really good at so-called instant mediocrity, which is not necessarily a bad thing because instant mediocrity at scale can do a lot of things, and job descriptions are a great example of that. We don't need job descriptions to be works of art. We just need them to be reasonably effective. AI is really good at that. A lot of HR managers I've talked to are excited about job descriptions. Okay, that's great. But there are vendors in the HR space that are talking about using these systems to present a qualified list of applicants. Well, have fun with that because I think there's going to be a lot of legal implications to that because these systems are not going to be able to explain how they derived those applicants because that's not the type of explainability that I expect us to make a lot of progress on. So what do you do about that? Well, you have to ask tough questions of vendors. You have to understand that the legal consequences of this have to be looked at carefully. And then in one of my big frustrations is that we don't use these systems to compensate for human weaknesses enough. So instead of asking the AI system to show me a short list, why not ask the system to show me a list of candidates that I'm not considering? So instead of going over the stuff that I should be doing, give me a check on that and say, wait, I can do a skills-based search of this database that you cannot, and I can surface candidates that you have not considered. So that comes down to systems design. So in my mind, when you think about problems like explainability, you have to take that into account, not as a fatal problem in the system, but as something you have to design against. So I'd love to hear Michael's comments on that.
Yeah. So we talked about the topic of bias previously in some of our CRM convos, but I think the main point I wanted to clarify is that I totally agree with Jon that bias is a natural human kind of mode of operation. Like we all have our individual biases, and and each one of these bias decisions are actually very hard to kind of detect or determine. In when you have very small sample of kind of decisions. The problem with AI is that it collects a lot of these data together and it learns very, very fast, right? So it tends to magnify some of these biases, right? So the small, minute, right? So if you have if you take a coin, right, and just it's just a fair coin, right? If you flip it kind of any finite number of times, you're not going to get 50-50. If you flip it 100 times, I guarantee you, very unlikely you're going to get exactly 50 head and exactly 50 tail, right? But if you flip it 1,000 times or 1,000,000 times or 1 billion times, right, then that gets more closer to exactly 50%, right? So these are just natural statistical variations. And so same thing for decision, right? Decision that are I would say, biased slightly, right? I mean, if you look at a small sample, they look just like these statistical fluctuations. Right? You may miss them, right? But they could be real biases that are inherent to how humans make decisions. And if you actually look at a large number of training data, right, and learn, because AI can learn very, very fast from a lot of data, then they get magnified, right? So that the magnification of these biases is what's probably more a valid concern for a lot of these, I would say, enterprise applications. And I think that a lot of people treat bias as sort of a data problem, and to some extent it is. But at the end of the day, ultimately it's a human problem, right? The reason the data is biased, the training data is biased, is because we are biased. So we need to learn how to make less biased kind of decision, or and actually AI can actually help us do that, by making
Agreed.
can actually make I would say data available, right? I mean, if you're a hiring manager, you come to the job like for, I don't know, for a year, and you're hiring say an engineer, right? And you hire a male, and out of college, and to you say, hey, I hire one person that happened to be a male, right? Why is that biased? But if you actually look at, if AI is able to show you for the past like 5 years, all the people in this company have hired like 80% male and only 20% women, right? Maybe you rethink how you should consider it. Maybe you should try to look at more female candidates, or something like that, right? So you could actually help you put your decision in context of all the other, the bigger context, right? So you may not be even aware that you're making a biased decision, right? But if you actually was shown those data, maybe you would be more cognizant of the potential. Are you aggravating the bias, or are you kind of mitigating the bias, right? So that's
Before we are moving on into explainability, question from my side: doesn't this put bias, or the topic of bias, and similarly toxicity that we didn't mention at all so far, plainly into the camp of solvable problems? Technically solvable problems?
It's a little bit, I would say, different, right? Toxicity has to do with the interaction with the individual, where the bias, I think, so there's the different kinds of bias, right? So the bias that we talk about now are the bias that's inherited from the training data. So I call these inherited bias. They're actually emergent bias that actually arise from your training policies. Okay, so yeah.
The reason I don't consider it a solvable problem, Thomas, is that it's unlike a problem like for example token limits, where once you solve that technically, it's done and we can relax. You can't relax on the issue of bias ever, even if the systems themselves become more quote unquote objective. There's always the problem of loading some kind of flawed data set into that system and running into the problem again, which is why confronting bias has to be an organizational discipline. And I totally agree with Michael, because this whole thing is, we spend so much time in this field talking about generative AI replacing what we can do instead of powerfully augmenting what we can do. And so many HR vendors could be spending time building HR systems that help confront our own patterns of discrimination, but they're not doing that yet. That's not sexy enough. And to me, that's very sexy, because that's going to help us compensate for our own weaknesses. And that's how I want to talk about AI is how to help us compensate for our weaknesses. Not, oh my God, it can replace everything we do. It's just as good as writing a blog post as me. It's just as good as doing this as me. It's like bullshit. It's not as good as me at those things, but it's really good at some other things that I'm not good at. That is fascinating to me.
Yeah, totally. So I think I can talk all days about bias, but I think ultimately I think I totally agree with Jon that I think using AI to kind of augment our weaknesses and kind of compensate for our weaknesses, right? Because we may think that we are unbiased or objective decision makers, but everyone is biased. Everyone have their own kind of heritage, unless you are just a baby. We have absolutely no context at all. It's coming out of the womb. then you're biased in some way, right? So every decision, every experience that we have in the past shape our decision today, right? And that's to some extent biased because everyone's kind of experience is different, right? So in the large scale, right? I mean, the ideal situation is that like each one of these individual differences get averaged out. So in the grand scheme of things, hopefully things are unbiased. But unfortunately, that is not the case, right? We have some systematic bias that are similar, among all of us, right? That kind of sway the pendulum one way, and AI can actually make us aware of that more and actually try to compensate for that. So yeah,
I would love to hear Michael's take on explainability because I think the interesting thing there is it's in many ways it's core to trust, but not always. So for example, like when I rely on my Google GPS, I actually don't need it to explain why it did certain things most of the time. I kind of just go with it. But when you, in my example of like why you presented a list of these qualified candidates and not these other candidates, I might really need to know why you decided to do that. And that might have legal implications for my organization. So I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, so trust. Let's start with trust because I feel like that's ultimately the more important thing, right? Because so yeah, you may not have questioned your GPS, right? But I kind of give this example in some of my talks. Is that like if anybody who had used the app, Waze, they probably have the experience that the first time they use it, they kind of wonder why did Waze kind of tell me to go in this very tiny little alley that no, I never went this way, like this. I just want to go to work, and that's the normal ways. I go on the freeway and I exit the freeway, but then you key this destination or your work location into Waze, and they tell you to go in this little tiny alley through this, and that you never go. So sometimes you wonder why, but then if you follow that route, by Waze, you get to your destination faster, right? And and then you hear your colleagues say, oh, the freeway had a big accident, there's a big backup there, that you didn't know about, right? So this is how you develop that trust, right? I mean, so first you question, and it's natural for people to question things that they don't understand, right? Why do you route me to this little tiny alley, right? I mean, where I normally just go in this freeway, that seems to be the fastest way to go about, but I may not aware of the current situation at all times, right? So and Waze, through this kind of collective kind of reporting, it has a lot more visibility to the current condition, the road condition. Maybe some area is flooded that you don't know. Maybe some areas has an accident that you don't know, right? So these are things that could happen anytime, right? So so the trust is built because through repeated kind of experience that you actually get you to a destination, faster, more reliable, or and without kind of. So you build that trust, so you don't question it anymore, right? That's why. So
interference there, Michael. Sorry, if you want to see trust as a credit, how do you deal then? Because I don't want to build trust. Often I need to trust right away.
Well, I don't think.
How do you deal with that then?
There are things that could help, right? There are things that could help with trust. So people don't trust things that they don't understand, right? So transparency helps, explainability helps, right, with trust. So let me get to the explainability topic just a bit. But all of these things are things that's designed, that you could design the system to help you build trust, right? So if on the other hand, if Waze, tells you that it goes this way, right, and it knows that you normally take the freeway, and they say, oh, today there's a big accident on the freeway, things are backed up, for 30 minutes, so that's why I route it this way. Then it's not. Then you say, oh yeah, now sure, I'll go this way, right? Naturally, you would have a much easier time to trust it. You may question that, oh, is that really accident there? Should I kind of Google for it? So you may even question myself, oh yeah, there's accident. So over time, you start to build this trust. But
again, often it's a credit. Often it's a credit.
Yes.
Take another example, not Waze, and I could go on with Waze versus Google routing. They are often different. Take the sales rep.
Take what?
The salesperson.
Oh,
the salesperson uses their that guy. well, they use their system to determine which opportunity to follow up, to work on, because they think it has a high likelihood to close.
Yep.
So now their sales automation system tells them it's another opportunity. And then the guy sits there and says, why the heck should I consider that one? This one is what my gut tells me, what my experience tells me. And this is where trust is a credit. So in order to go for the system, suggestion, prescription, take your choice, I need to trust right away.
Well, I mean, you may not, right? I mean, you don't have to. The thing is that, like, maybe your colleague who took the trust, right, take this prescribed recommendation, and he actually closed a lot more deal than you do, right? Then you say, oh, that's curious. You know, I'm more experienced than he does, and how come he's closing more deal than I do? And then you ask him, oh, I just take the recommendation from the AI all the time. Then maybe
that doesn't need explainability. Sorry if I interrupt again. So at the moment I experienced that it's working, I don't need the explainability anymore. I need the explainability in the moment where I do not trust the system.
Explainability helps. It doesn't completely
of course not.
Yeah. So I could explain, like I said, the Waze example, right? You could tell you that there's an accident, but you still don't trust it. You have to Google it, right? But then eventually you may come to the conclusion that it's probably correct. This is probably the way I should go. Right?
So it's my contention that for the foreseeable future, and I mean the next few years, there's going to be limits to how much progress we make on explainability technically. Like I said, I think in some cases where information is sourced, the machines will be able to say where they pull that information. But to Thomas's point, as far as explaining why they picked certain prospects over others and stuff like that, that's generally, I don't think, that's not within the scope. And so what you're going to have to do is accept that in your design. And in some cases, it's perfectly acceptable. Like in your sales leads example, there's no legal consequences for that. So to Michael's point, if you're getting better results, then who cares, right? Your colleagues who use the system are doing better. You're going to do it too. Fine. But in an HR example, that's where customers have to be cautious because that lack of explainability could bite them in the ass from a legal perspective. And so it all comes down to really honing in on the use cases, in my opinion, around this issue.
It does. I think explainability is a lot more important in some use cases, especially when the decisions have very, very high stake. So So I was, let me go into explainability. I kind of would disagree a little bit with Jon that in the sense that, like, I think there will be a lot more kind of progress in explainability because we are already there's already a huge community around explainable AI. Explainable AI, I sometimes call it a misnomer because it's not an AI per se. It's algorithms or other tools that is applied to a black box type of AI system to make them more transparent, more explainable, and it doesn't actually completely explain every single thing, but you don't need complete explanation of the black box anyway, because it has like billions of parameters. If I tell you how every single one of those parameters contribute to my decision, you're not going to be able to process that anyway. I'll take maybe the top 10 contributor to the final decision. That's probably, if you don't happy with that, take 20. If you're not happy with that, take 50 more, right? You could take however many you want until your brain is able to process it, right? So explainability is actually has been around for quite a long time, So back in the day when I was a graduate student, we used neural network to model the human brain, and there was actually it is actually peer-reviewed published journal. I could give you the citation to that if you want. That it was precisely around this. Oh, how can you explain what this black box is doing? So we actually go in, we apply principal component analysis to understand how these what the neural network is actually doing to the visual processing to come up with the response, what the predicted response of the, and so even back then we have those type of models. It's analysis and tools and algorithm that let you understand how a black box type of model, right? It could be a neural network, could be a random forest, there's many black box type of model that just very hard to interpret because they have so many model parameters. how those black box model come up with the output that they come up with, right? So if they offer you sometimes explainability is good enough, sometimes it's not good enough, right? So I think those are exactly what Jon says, is very use case dependent. But explainability, there's already, I would say, a lot that's been done. I mean, even for the HR scenario, there are, I would say, cascading Gen AI type of thing, using another Gen AI to explain the choices of one Gen AI based on the data they were given, right? So those are actually plausible ways to similar to this dealing with hallucination, right? There's a grounding, right? Grounding through retrieval augmented generation, right? You're not actually asking ChatGPT to answer your question. When you actually ask a question, it actually goes directly to the search engine to search the answer, right? From your vector database, from the web, from whatever it may be. Then what's been retrieved by this search, right? You give it to ChatGPT and you simply ask ChatGPT to answer your question with these retrieve kind of document that potentially have the answer in it. And that's a very different kind of question than asking it to answer your question out of
yeah.
your memory.
But even IBM, that's invested a ton in RAG, will admit that it doesn't solve the problem of hallucinations, which is a different topic I was going to get to on my list of unsolvable problems. But so just this explainability thing is important because a lot of people in the enterprise are maybe not aware that there's some fundamental pursuits happening in the AI field around all of these topics and debates around how these problems are going to get solved and what the time frame is. And, I think we surfaced our first disagreement. I think explainability is a little bit of a tougher problem than Michael with the size of the data sets. But that disagreement doesn't really matter in the sense that I think we can both agree that right now you have to accept those limitations and design with those limitations in mind. And one of the really important things to think about with these systems is when you look at use cases, you have to think about two things with AI, especially generative AI. One is constraints, that these systems function better when you put constraints upon them, such as role-based constraints. So, for example, the kinds of digital assistants that have proven most effective are mostly very focused on specific roles. And the reason for that is because you can limit it to specific data sets and specific parameters where you get in a lot less trouble around open-ended queries and things that the system isn't prepared to generalize about. Constraints and then the cost of outliers is the other key issue. So, for example, I received a promotion from a startup doing generative AI for mushroom identification. Now, mushroom identification is very constrained, but the outlier problem is very, very serious because poisonous mushrooms are really not something I feel like letting generative AI decide for me. I'm not going to defer to generative AI for that situation. Self-driving cars are fascinating in that regard because one of the reasons we have really struggled with the promises that a lot of overcapitalized people have made about this is because the constraints and outliers problem gets more and more intense once you move past very specific road conditions, right? And so when you look at use cases in AI, I always look at how is this constrained in a particular way that plays to the strengths, and what are the costs of the outliers, which gets to our past examples around when there's more legal and compliance ramifications, which is one reason why, for example, in the financial services industry, you don't see banks rushing to have these kinds of bots interacting with customers because there's legally compliant aspects of that interfere with that. Whereas if you give the same kind of bot to a customer service rep, you don't have those same implications necessarily because it's not a customer-facing bot in that case. So to me, these kinds of things are really important to understand and how they implicate the entire field. Now, there's a bunch of different ways in which people are trying to solve these problems, and we could have an interesting discussion about that from a research perspective. But for the moment, we have to understand what these systems are good and not good at. I don't think you're ever going to, in the current environment, get rid of hallucinations. And I've had some arguments with some people on my PR about that because I hear from vendors saying we don't have any hallucinations. And I've asked them to produce customers who can tell me that, and I have not yet. And the reason that there's a difference between hallucinations that are just completely off the wall versus certain kinds of inaccuracies. And I care more about the inaccuracies because I don't care if the chatbot suddenly says something really weird. What I care is that consistently it's accurate all the time. And one of the reasons why I think it's going to be very interesting to watch the enterprise in the spring is because we're going to see every single technique possible applied to these systems to make them more accurate. We're going to see the RAG type of approaches that Michael described. We're going to see human-based reinforcement learning. We're going to see industry-specific LLMs, not ChatGPT type LLMs, but industry-specific LLMs that are fine-tuned by customer data and by domain experts within those companies. And we're going to get a really good view as to how accurate these systems can be when all those different elements to improve accuracy are applied. And I think it's going to be a very fascinating time. And I do expect the accuracy to go up quite a bit. However, I don't think it's going to ever resolve all these problems without some infusion of cognitive systems and other techniques. And by the way, there's startups working on this right now, so I'm not crazy, but some of them are very well funded to help these machines become more aware of the context of the information they're spitting out. But this spring's going to be fascinating because we're going to find out just how good we can get, and that's going to inform the field as a whole. So for once, the enterprise gets to be a leader in technology instead of a laggard, because these techniques to make AI more responsible and accurate are beneficial to everyone. And Michael, I'm sure, is going to be heads down working on this stuff, so he'll probably be one of the first people to give us a progress report. So that'll be awesome.
Ooh. Yeah, we certainly have some on the pricing area that you mentioned earlier. So, and in fact, we do use explainable AI to kind of explain the decisions of pricing decisions, which actually, to a lot of people, it may not have, I would say, legal ramification, but it's their job on the line. Probably. If you, so that's also very serious. I would consider that a high stake decision as well.
In how far do you see it used? So the explainability component or the explanation component?
It's used a lot. I mean, because very often, typically it's the same thing as in explainability in any other situation. When someone disagree with you, when someone don't trust you, right, or something, then explainability is crucial, right? Because when you say, I priced this thing, 3% higher in this market than the other market, and your boss or your whoever is managing you may ask you why, and then you're going to say, because of blah blah blah, and then you can explain it, then it's okay, right? It's the same thing, right? If you have a machine or whatever AI you want to call it that tells you that help you invest in stock, they pick stocks for you, right? If you pick something that you normally would pick, right, then you say, it's exactly what it should do. No question asked, right? Because that's what you would have done. But if you pick something that you would not pick, right, then you would ask, like, well, why? I mean, I wouldn't do that. I mean, why would you recommend this? I mean, this is something I would never pick. So you would ask when it conflicts with kind of your expert knowledge of what should be the decision versus the AI's decision, which is in conflict with each other. So that's
I have a question I really want to ask Michael, because I think it's really important. There's two big aspects to ROI for these systems. One is the fact that putting humans in the loop does change the ROI equation, as well as defining the use cases. But the other piece is that these systems are at the moment very expensive to run, because they're obviously, the success of these systems to date has been based on expanding the parameters to the point where you have these very large language models. Now, one of the interesting things is to what extent, I do think we'll get more cost control over time, but one of the interesting things is how can we get to the point where smaller models can deliver similar results. And so for example, in a recent Workday earnings call, Anil Busri, the CEO, talked about how they're using customer anonymized data to train LLMs. And he goes on to say, we can then do domain-specific large language models, and those are smaller and less expensive. We can turn around and use those models to make our products more competitive, blah, blah, blah. So to me, that's kind of interesting, and I'm kind of curious because to me, I don't know if you agree, Michael, but I think there's some hope there as far as maybe we don't always need these massive models for enterprise use cases. And if we can decrease the compute required, which is one way of decreasing the costs, that's really interesting. I don't know if you agree or not.
Well, I mean, most of the compute costs is incurred in training.
Right.
So if you're actually using kind of, retrieval augmented generation RAG type of mechanism, right? Then it's still, I would say, costly to kind of, I would say, run it, but compared to the cost of training, it's actually much kind of, I would say
a lot less.
a lot less smaller. So they're essentially negligible, compared to the cost of training, right? If you look at like OpenAI, right, it estimate costs of just the hardware, to train it, it's like $63 million of hardware. And it took them like, I don't know, 3-4 months, like I don't know, something like 100 days or something like that to train. And not counting all the talent, all the engineer, all the data scientists working, right? Just the hardware, it's already $63 million. And it's, compared to when you're actually running it, you're just evaluating it, right? Then you're just putting an input in there and see what comes out of it. That's a lot less, okay? So when you actually, I would say that, the real kind of benefit, I would say the best kind of bang for the buck is to retrain it, to use kind of this retrieval mechanism, right? You can never get rid of kind of, I would say, these, kind of hallucination completely, 100%, right? Even if you use search, right, you have this kind of precision versus recall problem, right? If you search queries kind of too precise or too, you miss something, or you're getting some stuff that you don't want. You're never going to get a perfect kind of thing, perfect kind of answer out, right? But compared to like the work and the time, the effort that you need to kind of process all the stuff like coming out of a search engine versus is able to kind of give you something that may potentially, hallucinate a little bit, right? And I think it's a trade-off that personally I'm very willing to take that, like kind of say, I already tell it to answer your question based on this document. Don't answer, if your search did not actually find anything, then I'm not even going to give the result to ChatGPT. I'm just going to tell you that there is no answer for your question, in at least in my database, right? So that's kind of if you engineer it correctly, right? I mean, you could do kind of a input check, output check. That there's multiple check that you could employ to make sure that you minimize hallucination. There's no guarantee. You can never guarantee that there's no hallucination, but you could control it to such a But that's same thing for anything, right? I mean, even if you ask a human, I mean, how do you know? Like I could, my brain is not like infallible. Sometimes I misremember things. I said something that I thought I went to this place, but it's actually another place, another country that look very similar. But my brain is fallible too. That's these inaccuracies do come up even with actual human beings. I think when you actually come to that level of kind of acceptance of then I would say that that you can minimize hallucination to the point that where it's actually comparable to these human kind of error.
Which brings up Sayun's point. So especially his last sentence, hallucinations sometimes show we still struggle to simulate human context accurately in data, metadata, and parameterization. Agree? And if so, do you agree? And if so, how far can that be overcome? And how can it be overcome?
Yeah, so I think this retrieval augmented generation is one mechanism, right? So you could search and give it a result, but also give it the context too. Nobody said you only have, if you provided a question, you ask a question, I don't know, any question that you want, right? But so it goes to your whatever data that you want to use to answer it, to data source that you want, your maybe knowledge base or whatever, to search the result, right? Nobody says that the only thing that you could pass to the ChatGPT is the search result. You could pass on additional context too. You could, for example, who I am, who asked the question. You could pass it. This is the person who is the chief AI strategist. The pro is asking this question. I found this answer. And please answer his question with these documents. And you could say that, well, maybe I know where it is. Maybe I have the GPS location. You could pass those in, right? So maybe so you could pass in additional context too. You don't have to. It's just up to your creativity and how you kind of the engineering challenge comes down to how do you compress all those contacts within that token length, right? I mean, so that's the question that one of the solvable problems that Jon mentioned earlier. Yeah.
So and I'm still waiting on the vendors that have told me that their systems don't hallucinate to provide me with the customer. But I think, to Michael's point, I think the two things that are really important here are, one is just if you accept this fact that you won't ever get rid of that at the moment, at least the foreseeable, then you have to apply constraints so that within specific domains, and then you have to make sure that humans are in the loop in cases where an inaccuracy is very, very costly to you. But the good news is, in a lot of situations, inaccuracies aren't that costly, which is why these systems can be so powerful and useful. There's a lot of situations where just improving predictive performance matter. And, there was a generative AI at work study done around customer support and showing the benefits, especially for junior level support agents of this type of technology, because it arms them with these more expert type informations. And to Michael's point, if you focus it on domain specific information and say, give me that information, you're going to have a better result. I mean, I think one really interesting thing about this technology is I use the phrase instant mediocrity, and I don't mean that as an insult, but not every capability I would say is mediocre. For example, I think the summarization capabilities of this system, these systems are beyond mediocre. Like some of the things I've seen as far as taking a huge document and summarizing the key bullet points, that's beyond mediocre to me. That's almost like superhuman. And I'm envisioning a time where I'm terrible with slide decks. I'm envisioning a time where I could just tell, a system like this to take my 10-page article and turn it into a 10-slide deck. And that'll be a great day for me because some people don't like to look at a blank screen. I can't stand a blank slide deck. Don't give me a blank slide deck. So, and one other really interesting one that we don't see much in the enterprise, but I did want to mention, is the always on aspect of these systems. So, for example, a lot of the commercial activity around generative AI, and I'm sorry if this offends people, is around porn, sex chats, and relationship chats and stuff like this. And the reason is because it's pretty sophisticated as a bot, and it's always there for you, right? And so as a human, if you want to apply some sense of connection to a bot and have a relationship with a bot, the always on capabilities of these systems are powerful. It's just in the enterprise, the always on part, we haven't totally figured out the best way that can help an enterprise excel, right? Because your bank is mostly online anyway, unless it's down for maintenance. But I think that's a really interesting aspect of this, is the always on aspect, and I haven't figured out what that means to the enterprise just yet.
Well, I mean, I think for customer support, right? I think that could be a huge benefit already, right? Because if you can actually, take most of the questions are probably simple questions that these bots can answer, right? I mean, I think there's granted some tough question that requires human, right? But you can always say, hey, I cannot answer this, tomorrow morning, first thing, my agent will contact you with the more comprehensive answer, right? So that's something that the fact that you can actually handle 80% of the easy question when people are not working, when people are sleeping, or then they actually free up their time during the day to handle more of those tougher questions, right? And you actually leave customer, I would say, a much better customer experience that way, right? So you're not always trying to hang him up to minimize that the handle time, right? So
cognizant of both of your time. So Jon both of you have a hard stop in 6.5 minutes.
Okay.
And
oh man, there's so much more to talk about though.
Yeah, there's so much more to talk about. So we'll do a take.
We'll have you back.
We'll do a take two. Sorry for that. Let's start early into my usual famous last words question. So we talked a lot of solvable yet unsolved, or partly unsolved, and harder to solve. I wouldn't say unsolvable problems yet. But which is the one or the two problems that should get solved most urgently? Starting with Jon, knowing that you need to not only get out, but get into some hosting your own webcast in a minute.
Another video show. So two quick things. One is, Michael, on the last time that you were on this show, you had cautioned about the potential flaws in fine-tuning a base model for customer-specific scenarios, because in the future you might not be able to swap out the base model if it was fine-tuned. I'm summarizing a little bit. I might be quite accurate. I've since talked with several vendors who claim that they can swap out base models even after they're tuned. Now, some of that I need to investigate further.
Yeah.
But if that's the case, that's a fascinating development for enterprise software, because typically in enterprise software, once you customize your software, to your point, you're stuck on that customization. So if indeed that can be transcended in this context, that's a pretty powerful development, but I can't say definitively because I haven't been able to investigate it further. But I've talked to several vendors that were very clear that they've at least made some good progress on that problem. My biggest interest, Thomas, is less in the technical breakthroughs, and I do think for example, there's some amazing scientists out here working on this. Like Yoshua Bengio is one of my favorites, and he's a big deep learning enthusiast who's trying to solve these problems of reasoning within deep learning systems. Dave Ferrucci, who is a founder of IBM Watson, has a startup that is trying to combine common sense and cognitive systems. So essentially attack this problem from the outside by dealing with the imperfections of deep learning systems by bringing in more cognitive and symbolic stuff, because these disciplines, to Michael's point, go back decades in AI, and the possibility of combining some of these threads in an interdisciplinary way is really exciting to me, and it's much more exciting than just expanding the parameters. So it's going to be interesting to see what developments are, but I think the most important thing right now is these kinds of discussions, and for customers just to have a much more precise understanding of the pros and cons of these technologies, how they can help them today, and how to mitigate it against the drawbacks. And so to me, it's more the understanding and the dialogue that I think needs to be much more open. And so I really enjoyed this conversation, because this is exactly what I think is needed.
And just for the record, I didn't mean that on a technology level, or that to ask that question on a purely technology level. I think there are societal things to be answered as well.
We haven't even touched on the topic of fakes, for example.
Yeah. I guess that had to be I'm also kind of a little bit disappointed that we didn't get to the more fun discussion around creativity, and I think I personally have a very I would say maybe contrarian view on that, because I do see the impact on society and artists and so on, but ultimately I do think that makes you more creative, because you have to create something even more. It's like I equate that to, for example, if you're trying to do a PhD thesis, right? If you have a advisor, you may come up with 10 theses, and your advisor going to tell you that, oh, that's been done 5 years ago, that's done by so and so in Europe, that's done, and like I think having these type of generative AI, make sure that what we create is truly novel, truly that nobody have done before, right? Rather than just a slight kind of a modification or copycat or some less well-known people, so I think that's where I see, like it ultimately, I think it also makes the whole discipline more I would say accessible to a wider audience. People would think that actually when machines able to play chess and beat the best chess player in the world, right? Then why would people play chess? But people actually use these platforms to help them get better at chess. Actually, people who play chess actually increase over time because of that. I mean, you could argue the same thing, right? I mean, a car can beat any human runner, right? Why do we still watch people race run, right? I mean, it's not about, so it's I would say that it makes people I would say a lot more, makes these kind of games or whether it's a game or art or some kind of a trade, a profession, trade craft, a lot more accessible, right? And so a lot more people get into it, and ultimately it also creates I think it creates a lot more creativity as well, because it forces people to be more novel, right? And not just being not aware of the fact that there is already been done, right? So
yeah, and just real quick, a lot of these systems were, in my opinion, unethically trained on the backs of creators who were never compensated. I just have to say that because it's just really important to me. But I think that's a separate than what Michael's point, which is the unleashing creativity part is a different conversation, which I think is a more optimistic part of that conversation.
Still, answering in repeating the question, what's the most urgent topic to solve in your eyes, Michael?
Real fast, because you've got about
what's most urgent, I would say, I think the one that has, I would say there's too many. I think the one that's actually probably have a lot more impact would be to make this a lot more accessible to a wider audience. I think that, being able to, I would say, build this model in a way that's smaller, much more deployable, less kind of memory and CPU intensive, right? So it's a lot more accessible to a wider audience. I think that will probably have the bigger impact than solving some of those. The more people who have their hands on this thing, the more they have the opportunity to explore and solving these very, very difficult problems. So I think that's probably a roundabout way of going about it, but I think it's one way that I see is very beneficial to society.
Okay.
I was about to say goodbye to Jon, but goodbye to Jon.
I just wanted to type into the internal chat that we have no qualms in having him drop out. But thanks a lot to both of you. Thanks a lot to Hayun and Sri for their comments and questions. And well, we surely hope on a take two, or no, well, not a take two, but a version 2 of this conversation. Thanks to you, Michael, as well.
Sure. Yeah. I think as long as Jon is available and I'm available, I'm more than happy to to discuss some of the
organized.
other topic that we didn't get to discuss. All right.
We'll get that organized. Thanks a lot.
As well.
See you and have fun.
Cheers.